So greetings, hello, welcome. So today's the 24th of November and I'm delighted to share with you my thoughts today in this continuing saga of what on earth is happening in my country of Britain. I'm speaking from my new centre here in France, having moved from Scotland in 2017, 2018, and I don't feel like I've moved at all. I've just come across the channel. I call this part of France South Sussex because the trees, the oak trees and so on, remind me of Stanley Woods and parts of the South Downs I know so well. The uplands here in La Creuse look to me like the Sussex Downs somewhere. So, yeah, and it feels like the same country. That's why I love Europe so much. It's not like I've gone anywhere. I've just moved south of the Channel. So I'm going to be doing my feedback on recent events in the last week. Today is my fasting day, as you know, each week since actually January this year. I mean, it's nearly 11 months now I've been doing this. And I've only missed one Sunday of fasting. That was because I was on abroad and didn't want to be impolite to my hosts. So I'm going to start by doing my feedback on this recent week, developments that have happened, particularly the election broadcast organised by the BBC with all people, four political leaders speaking in turn to the audience and what do I think of the feedback and so on. And I want to take that in turn. I'm going to go through them, but I want to make a general point first, which is firstly the role of the BBC and the other media, I think, in this whole Brexit debacle has been catastrophic. I've had some links to the BBC over the years. I've known lots of people that worked for them, and I think something weird happened in the BBC in 2016. I read an article by Gina Miller in the last couple of weeks saying that she had to pinch herself when she woke up on the morning after the referendum in 2016 and saw the BBC and Theresa May 100% going for Brexit, as if that was it, done deal, sorted. Well, when I looked at the figures, as she did, we realised Scotland hadn't voted for Brexit, Northern Ireland hadn't voted for Brexit, huge parts of England hadn't voted for Brexit. And suddenly we were being fed this kind of propaganda that Brexit is the only fair way to go. We'd been told the referendum wasn't even legal, it was just advisory, and yet suddenly they were voting in Parliament, go for it, Brexit. And Gina Miller said she couldn't understand why this false interpretation of that referendum had happened. I think I can explain it now with hindsight. I think what happened was the extremely wealthy oligarchs that run Britain behind the scenes, and I'm talking the billionaire types, and most of them are offshore, had made a decision and had actually been pressurising for the referendum from like several years before. It was their strategic choice. They pressurised the Conservative Party into that interpretation of those results, and they had funded the lying campaign that the Vote Leave people had done, which just squeaked home a majority with all kinds of dirty tricks. They were funded and helped by American billionaires, and we know the names of some of these people, and people like Steve Bannon were their sword carriers on a sort of ideological crusade to destroy socialism, which is why these right-wing oligarchs think they're doing a good thing, because they're destroying socialism, which is, kind of Britain is a sort of centre-left type of consensus and has been ever since the war. Well, that's been whittled away by Thatcher and by various other people who've all been trying to privatise Britain, basically, and destroy what remains of that social democratic consensus that people actually care about each other. What we've seen is people dying on the streets in the cold, unbelievable, shocking figures. And the Brexit lot are happy with that, because their plan is to, once they implement Brexit, is then to sell off everything else that's remaining, and turn Britain into essentially a puppet state of the US. That's what's written on the agenda. And some people in the cabinet are just ideologues for what they call Ayn Rand capitalism. This Javid chap is a devotee of Ayn Rand. Now, Ayn Rand was an American immigrant from Russia, Jewish lady, an intellectual of sorts, but she had one bee in her bonnet, which is that selfish capitalism and egotism is good. Socialism and social solidarity and community spirit is bad. Because, why? Because people are fundamentally selfish and evil, and therefore we all have to accept that and just get on and dog eat dog and fight each other, and out of that combat some good will happen. Well, I'm sorry, my dear Ayn Rand, you know, if you'd have been in my philosophy class, I would have failed you on like basic human rights, because the history of European intellectual life since, you know, the struggles of the Cathars and the Crusades against the Catholics, you know, the whole thing is a struggle for human rights, for justice. And eventually it was decided in the 18th century that justice and human rights have to extend to social rights, like the right to live, the right to not starve, the right to have a home, the right to not freeze on the streets. That was what the French Revolution was about. It was about the very poor saying to the very rich, enough is enough, guys, you know. And Ayn Rand just, I don't know, you know, bless her. She was what I call a pseudo-intellectual. But she's extremely influential behind America's bid for world domination as the sword arm of right-wing, corporative, you know, selfishness rules, okay. Now that's the same thinking that invaded Iraq without blinking an eye. In the name of corporatism, we will destroy an ancient noble culture of Islamic traditions, we will bomb its cities, we will throw, you know, whatever we want at it. And we'll get away with it because we rule. Hey, we're powerful. Oh dear, you know. And essentially Brexit is like the American invasion of Iraq, but in, you know, in a much subtler form. It's an intellectual takeover of our country. So why does the BBC go along with this? Why aren't speeches like mine on the BBC every night? Why isn't Thought for the Day having intellectuals? I wrote to the BBC and offered to do a letter from Europe, because the letter from America's gone. Alistair Cook died, bless him, very good man, I think. Well, letter from Europe, you know, it's quite topical, isn't it? They don't even reply, you know. I also wrote to the Director General of the BBC, or rather the chair of the committee that runs the whole thing, and I said, Dear David Clementi, the name of the guy, who's descended from an Italian musician, by the way, who made the policy decision in the BBC higher echelons to interpret that referendum as a done deal for Brexit? Where's the nuance? Where's the fact? Who in the BBC says, well, hang on, Scotland didn't vote for this. It's going to leave the Union if we do this, isn't it? Like, not one peep out of the BBC. Instead, we had propaganda from Brexit lots. You know, Farage is given endless hours of discussion time, pumping out propaganda for the hard leave, get Brexit done lot, which has created the intellectual disaster that we're in now, okay? They didn't reply. So you write again, they don't reply. You write under freedom of information legislation, they write back and say, we're not covered by freedom of information education legislation because we're entertainment. You know, I've had like toing and froing of letters. You cannot discover a straight answer from the BBC as to like who made that policy decision. I asked specifically who made that policy decision on what day in what committee. They won't tell you, even under freedom of information. Now I think that's totally wrong. They're the public service broadcaster. They've made essentially a propagandistic decision not to give airtime to people like me that are against Brexit because we love our country. They've given endless airtime to people like Farage and right-wing idiots like the people that are now running the Tory party. They've facilitated a coup against the old school Conservatives. I had a lot of time for the old school Conservatives, you know. Even David Cameron, in his government, I mean, austerity was a terrible mistake, unacceptable, but they didn't realise at the time. They thought they were saving the country from the deficit that Labour had run up. They thought they were doing the right thing. You know, the Chancellor of the day, who's now said he's going to vote Lib Dem, you know, these were moderate people. What the BBC has done by giving airtime to the extreme right and the Farage lot is facilitate a coup within the Conservative Party. All those genuine, decent, old-school Conservatives, Hammond and all the rest, have all resigned or been kicked out. Dominic Grieve, you know, these are people of integrity. What we have now is a fascist right-wing extremist cabal around Boris Johnson, who is their Gauleiter, their sort of blonde-haired bumbling, acceptable face of that coup. So when I see Fiona Bruce and the BBC setting up the debate in this kind of way, I would want, if I ever got to be interviewed as the head of whatever party, I would I would require a higher level of intellectual debate than the BBC gives permission for. What's the BBC has become is a dumbed down sort of dishing up, lack of thinking, lack of analysis. Everything is done by sound bites. Nobody gets to discuss ideas properly. And so, poor Jo Swinson, she is actually a clever woman. She doesn't stand a chance because she would want to sit down and actually discuss ideas. Same with Jeremy Corbyn, who, when he stood up and that chap challenged him and said, "You're evil, I hate you, I'm afraid of you and your socialism." And he said, "Well, I don't quite know what's going on with your mind, let's have a chat afterwards." What I would like, is the BBC to be reined in. What's happened is that the BBC is a private corporation. It pretends to be the public broadcaster, but at the end of the day, it's actually a private company. And it's a private corporation which is having the best of both worlds. It's creaming in through legislation the tax on broadcasting in terms of the license fee, but it actually is in intellectual cahoots with international capitalism and corporate sector. So it daren't do anything policy-wise that will annoy the Rupert Murdochs and the billionaires that run the planet behind the scenes of Anglo-American capitalism. And so there's no robust intellectual challenges. Now I find that, it's a real shame that we've become such a dumbed down society. So the first thing, in order to conquer the UK, the first thing you have to do is take away any actual intellectual debate in the public sector, And that's what's been done ever since 2016, in my opinion. We have endless game shows, and we have this sort of nonsense. It's like gladiatorial contest of Leavers versus Remainers. The BBC carefully, choreographs it, and they do it, present it in a way that the Remainers are fanatics. They're extremists. I mean, what an unbelievable propagandistic coup! This is Goebbels territory. And Bannon and Farage, has been reading Goebbels, because these people have been bashing on with their simplistic policy lines. Brexit means Brexit, And they hoodwinked and took over Theresa May. I thought the woman was quite intelligent when I met her, but the trouble is these people are completely in hoc to the corporate powers that fund the Tory party. We now know that it includes a lot of very wealthy Russian oligarchs who've come out of Russia, bought British citizenship, bought up parts of Mayfair, and are now trying to acclimatise themselves into British high society because they can buy their way in. But of course these people don't have a clue about what actually authentic British identity is. They think it's going to a club, dressing in the right clothes, shopping in St James, and wearing the right shirts, and swanning around spending lots of money, and that makes you British. Sorry, it doesn't. Britain was founded on the concept of fairness, justice, truth-telling, and integrity, and the idea of human rights, and also social solidarity, and robust intellectual analysis. We were one of the countries that gave birth to the scientific revolution. Newton was a very clever man, so was Sir Francis Bacon. These are my heroes intellectually. And, I will not turn my back on that tradition of my country deserves better than this dumbed-down rhetoric that's delivered us Brexit. Okay, that's my little thing. And I'm still waiting for a reply to my letters from the BBC about who makes policy and how dare they act in this fundamentally skewed and immoral way. Unbelievable. Okay, so then I want to talk about tribes. The next thing I want to talk about is most of my friends that watch these things and other colleagues know that I'm some kind of a druid. Probably don't really know what that means very much, but it means a truth-seer. My duty is to find Dharma in any given situation. Dharma is the same root word in Sanskrit as druid is in Gaelic and Celtic languages. It means that which is enduring and sustains everything. The Dharma is that without which the universe disappears. Because Dharma is the law within the very fabric of being, both materially and spiritually. John Toland, who was a great druid 300 years ago, said that matter is mind in motion. And behind that movement of mind in motion is the fabrication of what we see as material reality. So behind material reality is the Dharma of being itself, which is what we could call cosmic consciousness or the mind of God, as Berkeley, another great Christian druid, said, the great Irish scientist who also wrote about optics and light and so on. Most of the great British scientists that I admire, like Newton and also Thomas Young, who coined the word energy, they were interested in spirituality as well as physics. As so was Aristotle, all the great philosophers in my European tradition that I come from. That's what makes us think. So, as a druid, our job used to be to mediate tribal conflicts. And it was one of our fundamental duties as druids, and we know this from many, many sources, classical sources and others, that the druids were the peacemakers and mediators of their tribes. And the Celts had fierce warriors, they'd often be like setting off to conquer each other, like the clans of the Highlands were doing up until fairly recently. Well, rather than let that happen, the druids would go and talk to the druid of the neighbouring clan and try and sort out a peace deal. Okay, so I'm watching my country, Britain, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, divided into effectively a bunch of tribes. And I'm saying, as the peace druid of Britain, which is my title, formally speaking, and now having moved to Europe, I'm working with druids across the European continent because this is a Celtic heartland I'm speaking from here in Gaul. Most of my British colleagues don't realise the Celtic heartland of Europe stretches. The Celtic world was here in Gaul, it was central, and it still is, Brittany, all over France, there are these incredible remains of Celtic sites, and all the way to Switzerland, Austria, the Rhine Valley. This was all Celtic heartland of Europe. So it's incredibly important, therefore, that we mediate these conflicts. The reason I like the European Union is because that's what it's trying to do. And it's centred in Brussels and Strasbourg, both of which were originally Druid foundations. So I feel like I'm speaking from that ancient wisdom tradition, which was there long before the Romans invaded, bless them. Romans are a Johnny-come-lately. The Druids were trading with the Etruscans, who were much more civilised than the Romans. From the Rhine Valley, there are grave goods in Celtic princes and Druid burials, come all the way from Italy, 1000 BC, Latin Hallstatt times. There's a princess in Vix here in France, buried with all her finery and jewellery and all that, long before the Roman invasion. These people were highly cultured Celts, in touch with all the people in the British Isles, but also all the way down to Italy, the Balkans, all the way down the Danube, which was settled by Druid peoples. Celts have been discovered, in the Danube region. This is quite new. Archaeologists have been discovering this over the last 100 years. There's a lot of Celtic sites being found all over Europe, which have only really just recently been discovered. So what do I say as the peace druid of Britain about Brexit and the split? Well, I'm hearing all these different tribal voices, and I saw them on the stage when in this BBC choreographed, like a Punch and Judy show, they all got up and spoke after the other. I want to analyse what I see as the different tribes of my culture at the moment, and then try and come up with a peace deal. What would the peace deal look like? That's my duty as peace druid. Bear with me, okay? So we have, you see, I dispute, what the media says is we're split into tribes called Leavers and Remainers. I think this is a fake narrative. It's very interesting that in the Trump impeachment hearings, that rather nice woman from the Northeast, from near where George Washington came from, who's now gone and become an American citizen, Dr. Fiona, what's her name? I want to say, yeah, Dr. Fiona Hill. I had not met her, but she struck me as a highly intelligent witness. And her testimony was very damning of the people around the Trump cabal that have trying to hijack American foreign policy. And she pointed out something very interesting. She's someone who was in the National Security Council, understands how American intelligence is working in detail behind the scenes. And she said, look, Russia did interfere in the elections in America, big time. Seriously, there's no doubt about it when Trump was elected. And what she said is that what the Russians are doing is they go with both sides. So some would be, extreme Trumpites saying, elect our man, he's the best in the world. Some would be extreme Democrats saying, don't elect him, he's the devil. And what Russian intelligence is doing is trying to split American culture into a bifurcated, polarized, almost civil war intensity. Because that suits the masters in the Kremlin who, the way to conquer a nation is divide it, split it. And then you just kind of march in after they've destroyed themselves. That's what she said. Now, she's speaking with authority, that woman, Dr. Fiona Hill. This isn't me making this up. What's obvious is that that's what Russia did at the time of the 2016 referendum on leaving the EU. Russia, behind the scenes, secretly tried to escalate this into a civil war type situation, and they've almost succeeded. We've become such a polarized country as a result. This is why Corbyn, bless him, kept saying in his allotted time, I'm trying to bring the country together. He's trying to undo that damage that was done. And I'm trying to do the same. I differ in his analysis of how to do that. As you will hear when I go through the different tribes, I respect what Corbyn is trying to do, but I differ in my fundamental analysis, and I'll explain why. But the intention is the same. Okay. So anyway, and the fact that the Tories won't publish the latest intelligence report into the interference of Russia in the in the referendum is crystal clear proof that what I'm saying, or rather what Dr. Fiona Hill was saying, is 100% true. Where are people of the integrity and intelligence of Dr. Fiona Hill in Britain? We need her back, please. Please let her come back and work in British intelligence. We need that woman. And she can tell us what's going on. Because I do think our intelligence services have been hijacked and run rings round. It's shocking because no intelligence service worth its money, we spend millions on this thing, both GCHQ, MI5 and MI6. None of it is no intelligence service worth its salt would allow its country to be broken up, as has happened, and to be split up into these rival tribal, nearly warring states, And if it truly has come, as seems to be pretty much certain, partly at least from Russian sources, then it's scandalous. Are our people not up to the job? What on earth's been going on? I think what's happened is the Tory party itself was infiltrated by nefarious forces, hijacked, and they have tried to tell our intelligence people to do nothing and shut up and be quiet about it, and succeeded. It's the only explanation I've got. The intelligence service is only as effective as the people running it, which is Theresa May and now Boris Johnson. And to be honest, these people are not very bright. They have been bought and they're controlled by these sinister oligarchical forces. Some are American, some are Russian. I rest my case. That's kind of it's a really critical time we're at here, folks. That's why I'm bothering to fast and speak to you like this. Now I want to say, okay, what are these tribes? I'm going to run through them. We have the Liberal tribe. It used to be called the Whigs. It was the position in British politics and society that stood for fair play, human rights. It came in with the 1688 Glorious Revolution, so-called. It wanted a constitutional monarchy. It didn't want an absolute monarchy. And it gave us education. It believed in the liberation from slavery. It stopped the slave trade. It came back into power in a big time in the 1830s. 1832 it won a great landslide and created a progressive reform alliance which abolished slavery. It increased the mandate. You know, that liberal tradition gave us any rights we have, actually, because the alternative tradition, which was called the Tories, believed in a theocracy run by the Anglican Church, which we had no rights. We were serfs, effectively. No, ideally, no voting rights, or if so, then gradually only to like rich landowners, men only. And if it hadn't been for the Whig or Liberal tradition, that's where we'd still be at. We wouldn't even. I would be hauled off and stuck in the tower. You know, my head would be off by now. No, I mean that Whig tradition, that Liberal tradition, incredibly important. And I'm a product of the University of London, which was founded by that tradition. Jeremy Bentham and his group around the radicals of the day had come out of the horrors of the French Revolutionary tradition. They said, we agree with the French Revolution idea of liberty, equality, fraternity. We want the social advancement, equality for people, but we don't want to do it violently. We don't want to go down that French route, you know. We want to work with our aristocrats. Instead of chopping their heads off, we want to work with them and work through education to gradually reform us all from the inward as well as the outer. So it was to do with moral reform, with intellectual reform. Bentham wanted to redraft the laws of Britain so they're more humane. These are the people that abolished the death penalty, that abolished torture. You know, the Tories think nothing of torturing you. Well, sorry, Liberals came along and said, can't do that. We've been reading this Italian guy, Beccaria, who says torture's bad for you. We've been reading Voltaire, who says we all have human rights. We've been reading Rousseau. So that liberal tradition was the breath of fresh air from the pan-European intelligentsia of the day, who tried to modernise Britain. Okay. And it's an important tribe. I have, respect for a lot of it. It lives on in the Liberal Democrat tradition just by the skin of its teeth. Jo Swinson didn't do it justice, bless her. I mean, I have no problems with Jo Swinson. I think she's a fine person, no doubt, and it would be lovely to have a supper with her and her husband. I used to live very close to her constituency in Dunbartonshire. But I think that she came across as too weak. She didn't really represent her party effectively. She also fluffed her lines because somebody needs to tell her that the Liberal Democrats that she's now the leader of are a liberal and social democratic party. They were the merging of two parties, the Liberal Party and the Social Democrats, who were founded as a left of centre social democratic tradition. Roy Jenkins and Baroness Williams and other former Labour Party intellectuals who wanted a kind of a home for the left of centre, but who didn't want to go down the kind of Trotskyite route that the Labour Party was going down at the time, and were more from that Gaitskell tradition of socialist democracy. Now that is half the Liberal Democrat tradition. Poor old Jo Swinson, I don't know, she never did at university. I mean, she studied at the LSE where I did part of my degree. She obviously never studied political history. She doesn't seem to have a clue what the tradition is that she's supposed to be representing. And when that woman attacked her and said, you're just a right-wing Tory in disguise, you're not a left-wing at all, she should have immediately come back and said, no, my views are my views, but I represent a left-of-centre, social democratic and liberal tradition. The woman, I don't know, she seems to be lacking in the fundamental basics of the knowledge of what her tradition is all about, which I find shocking because it's not going to win friends and influence people. She needs to, bless you, Jo, you need to do some homework, rapidly, and realise that you actually represent a genuine left-of-centre liberal tradition, which is what that Whig, that left tradition is about. Okay, so who are our heroes? Well, I'm a poet. My heroes are the poets who stood up against those Tory autocrats. Byron. I've just been reading Byron's Mystery of Cain, It's a masterpiece. Byron was a liberal revolutionary who eventually went to help Greece get independence against the autocratic, totalitarian rule of the Ottoman Empire, and he died for it. Shelley was another who wrote poems against the Tories of the day, who were repressing the rights of working people. They were sending people off to Australia just for trying to form a little trade union in Dorchester. And they were sticking them in irons and shackling them and putting them on ships to go to Australia as prisoners, just for basic human rights for working people. There's a huge link between the liberal democratic tradition and the socialist, social democratic tradition that Joe needs to research and understand. Otherwise, we're in danger of losing it. Okay, that's the liberal tribe. It's a very important tribe, but it's not properly represented at the moment. And Gladstone is someone that was part of that tradition. He was a great intellectual, a philosopher and a historian, a Homer scholar. He was a classicist. These are there's a deep, deep tradition there that we mustn't lose. And the point is, and this is where Joe is quite good, is it is pan-European in scope. This liberal tradition is not just an invention in Britain. It's an invention in Holland. It was happening in Holland. The first kind of real revolt against totalitarianism was when those Dutch people took on the might of the Spanish Empire and defied it for 80 years and invented freedom of thought. And, if you were a philosopher in those days, you wanted to publish stuff, you had to publish it in Holland. Descartes, one of my intellectual heroes who dared to think outside the box, he went to live in Holland because you could publish and think and discuss the nature of God. In a lot of Catholic Europe, France and so on, you couldn't think about God. You just had to accept the revelation of God that the church dished up and told you this is how it is. Well, philosophers like me and Descartes, we want to think about those revelations. And then, so he had to publish it in Holland, right? And then when Britain got its Dutch Glorious Revolution in 1688, that idea of human rights came in with John Locke. That we Brits had duties and rights to actually think through things for ourselves, not just accept what the Tory grandees say. Well, very important. So next, I want to, and there's a tribe there, but it needs corralling and re-educating and reaffirming. I come from Canada, and in Canada we still respect our liberal tribe. I'm a fan of Justin Trudeau, as I was of his father. I've lived in Canada. I'm a liberal in the Canadian tradition. Because the Canadian liberal tradition stands for multiculturalism, because we're French and English, and lots of other people that have come. Many Scots gave their lifeblood for Canada, many Irish, many recent immigrants. It's a multicultural country, like my rainbow jacket, which, works. And it works because it understands why liberalism is important. And it's about love for the other instead of fear and hatred of the other. There are two reactions to the other. You can love them because they're different. They have different colour skin or different language or different religion. Well, how interesting. Let's go and have a meal and talk about it. Or you can hate them. You can throw stones at them. You can burn their houses, Canada discovered that actually the only way is the path of love. And that's what the liberal tradition stands for in my country of Canada. And by the way, the word liberal means free, freedom, liberated, enlightened. The whole understanding, liber was a Roman deity, and liber means to be enlightened ultimately. And it's also an adjective to mean generous. Once you're enlightened, you're very generous with your knowledge. If you're an enlightened teacher, you like to give knowledge away. And we would say of you, you have studied the liberal arts, meaning the arts that lead to enlightenment. And then once you've achieved that, you want to give them away. That's why